Shalom, this is James Trim. We're doing our first video in a little while here, and this video is on the two houses of Israel, and I hope in this video to do two things. Three things really. One, follow up on a previous video that we did that was on uh, the lost tribes, a Jewish perspective on the lost tribes. That lays sort of a foundation that this is really a Jewish topic, and to correct a lot of misunderstandings that exist in the so-called two-house movement, or amongst in the so-called Ephraimite movement, and at the same time to set up a springing off point from which a number of spin-off videos can be made, um, that may not require having watched this video, but would be helped by having watched this video first. Um, so we have handouts as usual with this video, and if you look in the comment in the video description, you'll find a link to where you can find those handouts. Before we get going here, I do need to encourage you to please donate, donate, donate. These videos are made possible by your donations, as are the free teachings that we put up at nazarenespace.com, nazarenespace.com/blog, um, scripturerestorationproject.com, etc., nazarenejudaism.com. All this material that we put out, the vast majority of which is free, is only available because of those that choose to support this work with your free will donations, tithes, etc. And we very much appreciate those that make this possible, and hopefully you will choose to be one of them. Uh, so we have, as I said, handouts as usual, and the first handout is titled "The Divided Kingdom." This is the scripture passage, 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 19 through 24, that describes the division of Israel into two houses, one of which became known as the house of Israel and the other as the house of Judah, or the northern kingdom as the southern kingdom, as it's sometimes called. The This is 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 19 through 24. So Israel rebelled against the house of David unto this day. And it came to pass, when all Israel heard that Jeroboam was returned, that they sent and called him unto the assembly, and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Yehudah only. And when uh, Yehovam was come to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Yehudah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen men that were warriors to fight against the house of Israel, to bring the kingdom back to Yehovam, the son of Shlomo. But the word of Elohim came unto Shemaiah, the man of Elohim, saying, Speak unto Yehovam, the son of Shlomo, king of Yehudah, and unto all the house of Yehudah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, saying, Thus says Yahweh, you shall not go up, nor fight against your brothers, the children of Israel. Return every man to his house, for this thing is of me. So they hearkened unto the word of Yahweh, and returned and went their way according to the word of Yahweh. 1 Kings 12, 19 through 24. We can see in Hosea 5:5, among many other passages, that these then became known as the house of Israel and the house of Judah. But the pride of Yisrael shall testify to his face, and Yisrael and Ephraim, Ephraim, shall humble in, or so, sorry, so shall stumble in their iniquity. Yehuda also shall stumble with them. So we have the house of Israel, also known as Ephraim. On the one hand, that's the lost 10 tribes, then of the northern kingdom. And then we have the house of Yehuda of the southern kingdom, which consisted of Yehuda, Benjamin, and also the Levaim, the Levites, who did not have land ownership in Israel, but instead tended to the temple, okay, which was in Jerusalem. Our next handout is the Northern Kingdom exiled, and for some reason I don't have it here, but 2 Kings chapters 17 and 18, far too much material to read here, detail the invasion of Israel by Assyria. This is where Elohim backed off his protection from the house of Israel and allowed Assyria to invade. And as I said, that is detailed in 2 Kings chapter 17 and 18. What we do have here in our handout is the description of where the Assyrians exiled the Israelites. They took the Israelites, and First Chronicles chapter 5 verse 26 tells us, an Elohim of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, and the spirit of Pilneser, king of Assyria, and he carried them away, even the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half tribe of Manasseh, and brought them onto Hala and Havor and Harah and the river of Gozan onto this day. So this land that's being described is the outskirts of the Assyrian Empire. And then 2nd Ezra chapter 13, verses 40 through 50, says, those are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoners out of their own land in the time of Hosea king, when Salmanassar, the king of Assyria, led away captive and carried them over the waters, and so came they into another land. And they took this counsel among themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country, and there never mankind dwelt, that they might keep their statutes, which they never kept in their own land. And they entered into Euphrates by the narrow places of the river. For the Most High then showed signs for them, and held still the flood till they were passed over. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely, for of a year and a half, and the same region is called Arsaret. Then dwelt they there until the latter time, and now when they shall begin to come, the highest shall stay the springs of the stream again, that they may go through. Therefore solace you the multitude with peace. But those that be left behind of your people are they that are found within my borders. Now, when he destroys the multitude of the nations that are gathered together, he shall defend his people that remain, and then shall he show them the great wonders. Now, verse 45 famously says that the lost 10 tribes went to the same region, a place which the same region is called Arsareth. And some people have thought, if only we could find this land of Arsareth, we could find the lost 10 tribes. The problem is that Arsareth, as we see in the King James Version, is really a Latinization of Eretz Zaret, another land, as we see in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verses 27 or 28, depending on whether you're looking at the Jewish or Christian version, where Elohim says that he will exile Israel to another land for not keeping his Torah. Okay, so there's really not any help there. We are going to do some future videos, more than likely. I expect to do some future videos on what became of the lost 10 tribes, um, tracing their paths and where they ended up. But that's not really what this video is going to be about. That's when I said we're going to have some launching off points. The point here is we don't know for sure. Uh, Second Esdras doesn't really give us an answer. Okay, our next handout is titled Ephraim Goes Their Own Way Apart from Judah. Now, we've kind of already seen that, right, in the passages that we've looked at. But I want to look at Jeremiah chapter 3. There's a lot of material to look at in Jeremiah chapter 3 about um, the two houses of Israel. And we'll look at Jeremiah chapter 3 in that regard in more detail later, not today, in another video. But today I want to look at uh, chapter 3, verses 6 through 7, or actually verses 6 through 8. Jeremiah 3, 6 through 8 says, And Yahweh said unto me, In the days of Josiah the king, have you seen that which backsliding Israel did? She went up upon every high mountain and under every leafy tree, and there played the harlot. And I said, After she has done all these things, she will return to me, but she returned not. And her treacherous sister Yehudah saw it. And I saw, when for as much as backsliding Israel had committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a bill of divorcement. That yet treacherous is Yehudah, her sister, feared not, but she also went and played the harlot. Now, what's important from these verses is what it does and doesn't say. First of all, it tells us that Elohim served the house of Israel a bill of divorcement. Um, I've seen many in the Ephraimite and the two house movement try and excuse this passage away or come up with theology around this passage that has to do with Elohim having given Israel a bill of divorcement, but the bill of divorcement wasn't ratified, and therefore the house of Israel wasn't divorced. Well, there's no such thing as a ratification of a bill of divorcement in the Torah. The Torah is very clear that if a husband gives his wife a bill of divorcement, the marriage is over and she's free to go marry somebody else. It doesn't say in the Torah she has to wait till it's ratified. Or he has to, there has to be some kind of ratification. It's not there. Okay. This is an invention that some people have come up with, and well-meaning people have repeated to try and keep the house of Israel from being divorced. But the house of Israel was divorced. There is a hope of Israel, but we'll talk about as we go forward here. So the important thing here is that the house of Israel is divorced, but Yehudah is not. Even though Yehudah went and played the harlot too, even though Yehudah saw it, because if Elohim had divorced both houses of Israel, there would have been no bride left and no remnant left. And that's what we're going to end up talking about here later is the remnant. This is also clear in Hosea 11:12. Ephraim has surrounded me with lying, and the house of Yehudah with deceit. But Yehudah is still wandering with El and is true to the set apart one. This brings us to our next handout, which is titled Judaism. Because some of the two house movement have a problem with Judaism. Uh, they want to insist that Judah is only one of 12 or 13 tribes, and that uh, that the term Judaism is therefore improper, or that the term Jew is therefore improper. And we're going to show that that's simply inaccurate. It's inaccurate because it's inaccurate because the scriptures we've looked at so far indicate that there's two houses, and one of those houses is the house of Judah. It's the only house that remained faithful in any way to Elohim, even in an imperfect way. And as a result, because it remained faithful to the temple in Jerusalem, whereas the house of Israel, they went and built their own temple up in the northern kingdom, and they set up their own non-Levitical priesthood. But those that were faithful to the temple and priesthood in Jerusalem, uh, they were called Jews, and that true faith came to be known as Judaism. And we see that for the first time in Second Maccabees, chapter 2, verses 19 through 23. This is important because this establishes this term as having existed long before the time of Yeshua. Verse 19, the story of Judas Maccabeus, or Judas Maccabee and his brothers, and the purification of the great temple and the dedication of the altar. And further, the wars against Antiochus Epiphanes and his son Eupator, and the appearances which came from heaven to those who strove zealously on behalf of Judaism. So that though few in number, they seized the whole land and pursued the barbarian hordes, and recovered the temple, famous throughout the world, and freed the city, and restored the laws that were about to be abolished, while the Lord with great kindness became gracious to them. And all this, which has been set forth by Jason of Cyrene in 5 volumes, we shall attempt to condense into a single book. So this tells us that the term Judaism wasn't coined here, even though this is the first place in literature we see it. That doesn't mean it's the first place that it ever appeared. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But we do know that by the time of the Maccabees, the term Judaism was existent, probably common. And in fact, in the first century, Josephus and Philo used the term Judaism regularly. This is important because Judaism was the religion of Yeshua, and Yeshua never, in all of his words, stopped and said, "Oh, and please stop calling this Judaism." In fact, some will argue that Yeshua wasn't Jewish, but in fact, in the book of Revelation, the resurrected Messiah, after his life on earth, resurrected and in heaven, is referred to as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Okay. Paul uses the term Judaism in Galatians 1:13 to describe his own faith. I've had people tell me that the word Judaism didn't even exist in the New Testament or in Yeshua's time. Here it is. If you have heard of my way of life that was from before, which is in Judaism, that I especially persecuted the assembly of Elohim and was destroying it. And Acts 23:6 tells us that Paul was not referring to his past life in Judaism versus his present life in Judaism, because in Acts 23:6, Paul says, and as Paul knew that some of the people were the Tzaddikim and others were the Parashim or Pharisees, he cried out in the assembly, "Men, my brothers, I am a Parush or a Pharisee, the son of Parashim, the son of Pharisees, and concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead am I being judged." So Paul declared in the present tense that he's a Pharisee, which is a was a one of the major sects of Judaism. So Paul wasn't saying that he used to be in Judaism. He was saying his past life in Judaism versus his present life in Judaism, as is attested in Acts 23:6. Um, okay, what is a Jew? Uh, Romans 3:1 through 2, Paul writes, "What is the advantage of a Jew, or what is the Jew, or what is the profit of the circumcision? Much in everything." In Esther 8:17, we read that after the events in the book of Esther, many of the Gentile um, Persians living in Persia were so impressed and so respected what Elohim had done that they were in such awe of what Elohim had done that they became Jews. Uh, as Esther 8:17, and in the very province, in every province, in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had gladness and joy, a feast and a good day, and many from among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews was fallen upon them. This is why we know that a Gentile who converts to Judaism becomes part of Am Yisrael, he actually becomes a Jew, not a, not an Israelite, not a Hebrew, a Jew, according to Scripture, became Jews. So proselytes to Israel become Jews, according to Esther 8:17. And that's because the only other house of Israel had apostatized. You couldn't become an Israelite, you had to become a Jew. Very interesting here also, the Septuagint, where it says became Jews. The Greek is Judaized. Um, and that is the real meaning of the word Judaize in ancient texts, in Josephus and in the Septuagint and Esther and in the so-called New Testament. To Judaize actually does not mean, though there would be nothing wrong with it, teaching others Judaism or trying to get other people to convert to Judaism. The word Judaize actually means to convert for one's, is something one does to oneself. One Judaizes by becoming a Jew. We do a whole thing on how that's misused. Um, New Testament passages are misinterpreted by people who don't understand what the word historically means. Okay. Um, Tobit 11:17 is also important. Um, I'm reading from the New American Bible. Before them all, Tobit proclaimed how God had. Well, first of all, it's important to know what the Book of Tobit is. The Book of Tobit is centers around a group of people from the house of Israel who had been transplanted up into this area on the northern outskirts of the Assyrian Empire. And it speaks about a family who were loyal to the temple in Jerusalem and sent tithes and offerings to the temple in Jerusalem. And then this verse says about them, before them all, Tobit proclaimed how God had shown mercy to him and opened his eyes. When Tobit came up to Sarah, the wife of his son Tobiah or Toviah, he blessed her and said, "Welcome, my daughter. Blessed be your God for bringing you to us, daughter. Blessed are your father and your mother. Blessed be your son Tobiah or Toviah in Hebrew, and blessed be your daughter. Welcome to your home and blessing and joy. Come in, daughter." That day there was joy for all the Jews who lived in Nineveh. So here it refers to these people as Jews. Now, the New American, the RSV and the KJV does not have the word Jews here, But the Hebrew text of the book of Tobit does have Jews here. And we could do a whole thing on the Hebrew text of the book of Tobit, but that's another study. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 2. You got to think on this one. You know that you were past tense Gentiles, carried away onto these dumb idols, even as you were led. And then Ephesians 2:11 similarly says, wherefore remember that you being in time past Gentiles in the flesh, who were called uncircumcised by that which is called the circumcision in the flesh made by hands. So the point here is that Paul, in addressing the Corinthians and the Ephesians, was addressing a group that he said were formerly Gentiles, which means what's the opposite of a Gentile? In Paul's own writings, it's a Jew. You have Jews and Gentiles. Okay? So if they were in the past, they were formerly Gentiles, they were converts to Judaism. They were Jews. All right, let's talk about the remnant. In the first two chapters of Isaiah, we see a prophetic rebuke aimed to each of the two houses of Israel. Isaiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 23 contains a prophetic rebuke concerning the house of Judah and Jerusalem, which is in the house of in Judah, as we see in chapter 1, verse 1. While chapter 2, verses 5 through 22 contains a prophetic rebuke directed to the, quote, house of Jacob, which is mentioned chapter 2, verse 5, which is a reference to the house of Israel. Israel, Jacob, and Israel are synonyms. The house of Judah is observing Torah in some way. They're offering sacrifices and incense and observing new moons and Sabbaths and calling of assemblies, we see in verse 13. But Isaiah 1 calls them your new moons and your appointed feasts, whereas the Torah refers to them as my appointed feasts. This is why Yahweh's Nephesh hates their appointed feasts in verse 14, because they're supposed to be Yahweh's and they've made them theirs instead. The house of Judah is observing Torah in an empty way because they violated Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 18, in rejecting the Messiah. And we did a whole video on this titled A Prophet Like Moshe, Prophet Like Moses. You can go back and watch that video. Their Torah observance is empty and meaningless because it's lost the soul of the Torah, which is the Messiah himself. The Messiah is the soul of the Torah. The house of Israel, also called the house of Jacob, is rebuked for having turned from the light of Yahweh, verse 5, chapter 2, verse 5. And we know from Isaiah 20, chapter 8, verse 20 later that is the Torah. And forsaking your people, chapter 2, verse 6, and turning to idolatry in chapter 2, verse 7. But Isaiah chapter 1, verse 9, which is in the portion that talks about the house of Judah, there is a key passage that's very important. It says, except Yahweh of hosts hath left unto us a very small remnant, we should have been as Sodom, and we should have been like Gomorrah. So if this passage tells us that a very small remnant of Judah is preserved. This takes place in the rebuke of the house of Judah, while the house of Jacob abandons the Torah and their own people, the house of Judah, and turn to idolatry. The house of Judah still is observing Torah, at least, though in an empty way. There's a remnant of the house of Judah which has not rejected Torah or the Messiah. That remnant is very important. In a footnote to Isaiah chapter 1, verse 9, the Ryrie Study Bible has the following comment. Now, let me parenthetically say, I'm not a fan of the Ryrie Study Bible. I sometimes have quoted and will quote the Ryrie Study Bible to show things that it's wrong about. In this case, it's right insofar as it goes. It says quoted in Romans 9:29. Well, there's no doubt that it's quoted in Romans 9:29. Then it says with reference to Christian Jews. Well, I take issue with the term Christian Jews in the Ryrie Study Bible here. It's not in reference to Christian Jews, it's in reference to Nazarene Jews. Um, but Ryrie gets it almost right. So that's very important. Uh, what's very important is that Romans 9:29 does quote Isaiah 1:9 with reference to Nazarene Jews, the remnant of the house of Judah. Um, the remnant is, in fact, Nazarene Judaism. By the way, the remnant is also mentioned in the last verse of Revelation 12. And there it has, the remnant has the two qualities of Nazarene Judaism. And those two qualities, which I believe we've talked about in a previous video, those two qualities are, again, the they are Torah observant and they accept the Messiah, Yeshua. Okay, let's go to our next handout, which is titled One Faith. Um, I want to establish from a couple of passages in the so-called New Testament that there is only one true faith. Even though there are 666 sects of Christianity, um, there's only one true faith. Ephesians 4:5 verses 4 through chapter 4 verses 4 through 6 really. There is one body, one spirit, just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, or one immersion. One Elohim and Father of us all, who is above all and through all and in us all. So there's one faith. Then we go to Jude 1:3. Beloved, being very eager to write to you of our common salvation, I found it necessary to write appealing to you to contend for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints, or the set apart ones. And so from these two passages, if we bring them together, we see that there's one true faith that was only delivered one time. Now, Christianity believes that there were two true faiths, one that was delivered in Old Testament times, and one that was subsequently delivered in New Testament times to replace it. This is simply, you have to ask, do they read their own scriptures? Okay, because the scriptures tell us that there is one faith and it was only one time delivered, and Christianity is far too young to be that one faith that was once delivered. That has to be Judaism. And we covered this so well in previous videos, and especially the one we did on the restoration of Nazarene Judaism, that the ancient Nazarenes were a sect of Judaism and did not call themselves Christians. They weren't Christians. They weren't a sect of Christianity. They were a sect of Judaism. The original followers of Yeshua was the Jewish sect of Nazarene Judaism. They were not Christians in any form. But notice that they were called Jews, which we've talked about so many times before, and as I said in the Restoration of Nazarene Judaism video. So our next handout is Salvation is of the Jews. There's a topographical error there. It says salvation if of the Jews. It's actually salvation is of the Jews. This brings us to the encounter between Yeshua and the Ephraimite woman, or the Samaritan woman, in Yochanan chapter 4. And he came to a city of the Samaritans, which is called Shechar, by the side of the field that Yaakov gave to Joseph his son. And there was there a well of water that had belonged to Yaakov, and Yeshua came and sat upon the well that he might rest himself upon from fatigue of the road. Then verse 8 actually belongs next and appears next in the ancient Old Syriac Aramaic version. Here is where we read, and his Talmudim had entered the city to buy themselves food. And then verse 6 continues, and when Yeshua sat down, it was about the sixth hour. And a woman from Samaria, verse 7, and a woman from Samaria came to draw water. And Yeshua said to her, give me water to drink. And then our Greek text inserts verse 8 here, in verse 8. That an out of place phrase about the Talmudim entered the city to buy themselves food. Verse 9 is actually next. That Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, who are a Jew or Judean, yet you ask from me to drink, who am a Samaritan woman? For the Judeans have no social dealings, or the Jews have no social dealings with the Samaritans. Yeshua answered and said to her, if you knew the gift of Elohim, and who this is who said to you, give me to drink, you would ask him, and he would give you the water of life. That woman said to him, my Adon, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. From where do you have water of life? Are you greater than our father Yaakov, who gave us this well from which he and his sons and his flocks drank? This is a key verse because she here identifies Yaakov as our father. And Yeshua doesn't correct her. So here we know this woman is an Ephraimite. Verse 13, Yeshua answered and said to her, every man who drinks from this water will thirst again, but every man who drinks from the water that I give him will not thirst forever. But that water that I give him will be in him a spring of water that will spring up into eternal life. That woman said to him, my Adon, give to me from this water so that I will not thirst again or come draw from here. Yeshua said to her, go, call your husband and come here. She said to him, I have no husband. Yeshua said to her, you have spoken well, for you have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and this that you are of now is not your husband. But what you have said is true. She so parallels Ephraim too, doesn't she? That woman said to him, my Adon, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem or Jerusalem is the place that one must worship. Because remember, I told you, the house of Israel built their own temple on Mount Gerizim, I think it's called, and the house of Judah had the temple, of course, on Mount Zion, on Mount Moriah. Um, Yeshua said to her, woman, believe me, the hour comes when not on this mountain and not even in Jerusalem you will worship the Father. You worship that which you do not know, but we worship what we know because salvation is of the Jews. But the hour comes and now is that the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. But indeed, the Father seeks worshipers who are like these. For Elohim is spirit, and those who worship him ought to worship him in spirit and in truth. By the way, Yeshua makes it clear that the true worshipers are Jews that practice Judaism in spirit and in truth, as opposed to the Ephraimite religion. And here we have a reference to Torah, and you can see Psalm 119, 142 for truth, and verse 151 for truth, and Ezekiel 36:27 for spirit there. Okay, so here this woman is, Yeshua is flatly saying that salvation is of the Jews, not the Ephraimites. Ephraim doesn't have it, Judah has it. The remnant of Judah, of course. All right, now our next handout is titled Ephraimites Take Hold. And the key passage here is Zechariah chapter 8, verse 23. Thus says Yahweh Zavaot, in those days it shall come to pass that 10 men shall take hold out of all the languages of the nations, or the Goyim, and shall even take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew, saying, we will go with you, for we have heard that Elohim is with you. So let's look at some interesting things here, first of all. 10 men shall take hold out of all the languages of the Goyim. This represents the 10 tribes of Israel, clearly. It's why it's 10 men. And these 10 men, or the 10 tribes, take hold, and it says, of the skirt of him. The word skirt here is kanaf, corner. It is the word that is also the word for wing, kanaf. It is the word that refers to the place where the tzitzit are placed in Numbers, I think, 15. Same word. So they basically grappled with the tzitzit of him that is a Jew, saying, we will go with you. Now that you, we don't have a plural you in English. We don't have plural and singular you, which is why here in Texas, we've developed a plural you, y'all. And up north, some dialects of English have kind of developed a plural you with putting an S on the end of you, yous. But in proper English, of course, there is no actual plural you. You can be plural or singular, and you can't tell the difference beyond context. But here in Hebrew, that's not true. And in Hebrew, here, the you is plural. We will go with you, plural, for we have heard that Elohim is with you, plural, not singular you. So those that have tried to interpret this to refer to Yeshua, a specific Jew, are wrong. It doesn't fit the actual Hebrew. This is referring to Judah, plural Jew, not singular Jew. Okay, and then we want to look at Ezekiel 37 and the two sticks prophecy of Ezekiel 37. Verses 16 through 22. And you, son of man, take you one stick and write upon it for Yehuda, and for the children of Israel his companions. Then take another stick and write upon it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Judah his companions. Start over here. And you, son of man, take you one stick and write upon it for Yehuda, and for the children of Israel his companion. Then take another stick and write upon it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel his companions. Then join them for you one to another into one stick, that they may become one in your hand. And when the children of your people shall speak unto you, saying, will you tell us what you mean by this? Say unto them, thus says Adonai Yahweh, behold, I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel his companions, and I will put them unto him together with the stick of Yehuda, and make them one stick, and they shall be one in my hand. Let's pause there. Now, so often we see representations of this, and it's thought of, especially in two house circles and Ephraimite circles, that the two sticks are brought together like this. Oh, we should do this in 3D. Okay. On equal terms like this. Okay. In the middle. But verse 19 makes it clear that's not so. It says, I will put them onto him together with the stick of Yehuda. So the stick of Israel will decide that this one's the stick of Israel, brings it over and joins it to the stick of Judah. That's what happens. They're not brought together in the middle. Ephraim has to come over to Judah. You see a pattern here? The pattern is in Yochanan chapter 4, the Ephraimite woman has to accept that salvation is of the Jews. In um, Zechariah 8:23, the Ephraimites take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew and say, "Hey, I've heard that Elohim is with you. I'll go with you." Ephraim doesn't grab hold of Yehuda and say, "Hey, haven't you heard that Elohim is with us? Come with us." Uh, Judah doesn't grab hold of Ephraim and say, "I'll go with you." That I've heard with Elohim is with you. It's the other way around. This is a consistent picture in Scripture because Ephraim's divorced. And here, once again, we see the same picture that Ephraim gets brought over and joined to Judah. Not in the middle, not the other way around. Okay? This is what the prophecy is telling us. Verse 20, and the sticks wherein you write shall be in your hand before their eyes, and say unto them, Thus says Adonai Yahweh, Behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the nations, that they are gone, and I will gather them on every side, and bring them into their own land, and I will make them one nation in the land upon the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king over them, and there shall no more be two nations, neither shall they be divided into two kingdoms any more at all. So here we do have the reunion of the two houses of Israel, but the reunion of the two houses of Israel have to do with divorced Ephraim coming over and being joined to Judah that's not divorced. What we have, very important here, and it will be something that we go into more detail and who we've talked about before, and we'll go into more detail in the future. The word stick, okay? The word stick in Hebrew is etz. Etz means stick, lumber, or tree. This is, by the way, why Acts sometimes refers to Yeshua as having been crucified on a tree, and why some people have gotten that wrong, and that's a whole different story. Because in Hebrew, the word tree and the word lumber are not only the same, but also in the book of Esther, the gallows on which Haman was hanged on was called an etz, lumber. Okay, so when Yeshua was crucified on lumber, that's all it means. Okay, and um, so what's significant here is that you have two sticks. You have two sticks, and in Romans 11, you have two trees. And in Ezekiel, one of them represents the house of Israel and the other the house of Judah. And if you understand Romans 11 properly, and we've talked about this before in some of our videos, and we'll do a Romans 11 video at some point that'll also go over this. We also did it through the book of Romans. The two olive trees represent the two houses of Israel. And just as in Ezekiel 37, the house of Israel is brought over and joined to the house of Judah, in Romans 11, branches from the wild olive tree Israel are grafted into Judah, not vice versa. This is a prophetic picture that is repeated over and over and over and over. Ephraim's hope is not to create a separate Ephraimite movement. Elohim doesn't even have in mind a two-house movement, in that he doesn't have in mind two houses remaining two. He has in mind a one-house movement, a house united movement, in which Ephraimite branches are grafted into Judah and fed by the root of the Jewish olive tree, and boast not against the natural branches of the Jewish olive tree, in which the stick of Ephraim is brought over and joined to Judah, in which 10 men from the house of Ephraim, 10 men come over and take hold of Judah, in which Ephraim is told salvation is of the Jews. This is over and over and over in the scriptures. Why can't people see it? Now, it's the remnant of Judah, which is Nazarene Judaism, uh, which believes in both Torah and Messiah, but it's a Jewish movement. It's a Jewish olive tree, not an Ephraimite one. Okay. Um, so I hope this video has helped you understand the two sticks, the two houses of Israel, and the place that each of the two houses play in prophetic prophecy, and the last days restoration of the house of Judah and Nazarene Judaism, and how Ephraimites are grafted in and fed by the root of that Jewish olive tree, and how natural branches are grafted back into their own olive tree, which is the great last days restoration of Nazarene Judaism. We're going to do more videos in the future. We're going to trace what's become of the lost 10 tribes, some of the places that they've gone, not necessarily all of the places that they've gone, but some of the places that they've gone. Um, and we're also going to talk about some of the nuances of some of the passages that we've covered here today. Let us know what you think in the comments section. Like the video and comment. We want to hear from you what you think. Um, this is probably going to shake some of you up as far as maybe some of your thoughts on the two house thinking and the lost tribes of Israel and the two houses of Israel and how it all fits together. And so we'd love to hear from you. And please hit the like button. And don't forget to donate, donate, donate. There's a link at the end of this, at the um, video description where you can click to donate. And you can also donate by sending donations to donations at wnae.org. That's donations at wnae.org. And we'll see you next time with another informative video. Shalom, everybody.